Good morning, everyone. So what I'm going to do first is identify a few key issues related to research and documentation. Then I'm going to ask some key questions. I think they're key questions. I'm going to briefly review what we've already seen a few times, but I want to emphasize again the role of community participation in the 2003 Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. And then I'm going to give you 3 case examples from my research. One project that brought a community from the Arctic. They were Inuvialuit or Inuit people to the Smithsonian Institution to view collection from their community. Another project that has to do with the documentation of endangered languages. And then a third project that's a community media project with a First Nations or Indigenous community in British Columbia in Canada. All right, so here's a photograph that I took a little while ago outside the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver. Does anyone notice anything about this image? Does anything strike you as interesting about the sign advertising a dance festival? Oh, yes, good eye. Look, regalia and songs are the cultural property of the dancers. Photos and video are not permitted. So why is this? Why would they put this on a sign? Well, the dancers believe that the clothes they're wearing, the dance that they're performing belongs to them, and they don't want people to document it because in their tradition it's not appropriate. So this is the question, what is appropriate in the context where you're working? And then you want to find out why or why not. It's interesting to know, this is part of Dr. Krepp's concept of indigenous curation. Why is something appropriate to photograph and document, and why might something not be appropriate? So those are important questions. The second issue is the issue of informed consent. So this means that when you take on a research project, the person that you're documenting understands what is going to be done with the product of the research or the documentation that's created. Again, what's appropriate in your field site? Do you need a form, a piece of paper like you all signed for the field school that says, I give you my permission to use my image in your educational projects and so on? Or are you going to have a verbal agreement? Is it enough, according to your community that you're working with, to just agree, give you permission to use their documentation in a safeguarding project? You have to ask the community for the answer. So that's part of your exercise. My other question is, how many of you brought film with you to put into your camera to take photographs with? Did anybody bring film? Who uses digital camera? Yes, me too. Who uses a digital audio recorder? Me. Who uses a digital video camera? Yes. Cell phone. Everything digital, right? So now we all deal with digital documentation. It's different than 10 years ago, let's say, or even more recently where we use tapes, photographs. This is an important change in the way that we do documentation. So here's a Wikipedia page that has a definition of the archive. The archive used to be about taking care of one single object, the original copy, or the original object. Just one. But now, because of digital technologies, we have multiple copies. This is what digital technology does. When you take a digital photo and you upload it into your computer, it makes a copy. So suddenly, this is a question of control. How do you control the documentation that you create because it's digital? This also raises the question of something called remix. I'm sure you're all familiar with remix. You probably do it yourself all the time when you make new media out of existing media. So, for example, just here's a song that Michelle talked about. Basically, Simon and Garfunkel, pop stars in America, they took that Bolivian pop song, or Bolivian folk song, and then Paul Simon wrote his own lyrics, and he sang over top of it, and it became his song. It became a Simon and Garfunkel song, and they made lots of money. So that's an example of remix. He took something that was already existing, that had been documented, and then he made his own song out of it. And that was a problem for the Bolivians, and that became a very important moment in the history of debates over cultural property and intellectual property rights. So I raise that as an example of the kind of thing that happened before, and now happens even more because we use digital media that's very easy to mix and change. Oh, and that's my point. We have to think about the issue of protecting documentation versus preservation. So not only do we think about how to keep it alive, but we think of how to keep it from being exploited. So again, what is most appropriate where you are working? Now today in my talk, I'm going to talk a lot about new media, but it doesn't mean that old media, whatever that is and whatever new media is, it doesn't mean that that's not also important and a really valuable way to document your heritage. So taking notes, writing descriptions, using film and a camera or any other form of documentation is really important. So I'm using examples from my research as a way to raise the issues to think about, but I think you should just take them as examples that allow you to think about the process. And then when you go back to your home communities, you're going to find for yourself what is most appropriate where you work. This is just a quick example. Here's a text-based documentation that documents the Khmer Shadow Theater, the Spectrum. So this is just an image to show you that here is an example of an ICH documentation that is text-based. All right, so some of the key questions that I want you to think about. Which forms of intangible heritage should be researched and documented? How should communities be involved in the process? What kinds of information about intangible heritage should be gathered? How can documentation reflect the local diversity of voices and perspectives? And how can appropriate forms of media be determined for the documentation of ICH? So photography, video, text, description, audio recordings. How are you going to find that out? To go back to consent, the idea of consent, what kinds of permission should be obtained at the time of documentation, and then to think about how those permissions might change over time. There's one reading that I connected to this lecture by Barry Tolkien. It's called The Yellow Man Tapes. If you get a chance to read it, it's very interesting because it's about how after years of documenting one man, a Native American man, after the man died, his family asked for the tapes to be returned so that they could destroy them because they didn't believe that those tapes should exist anymore. So that's an example of how permissions change over time. All right. So, community participation in the 2003 convention. We've seen this already in other lectures, but in Article 11B, it says that each state party shall identify and define the various elements of the intangible heritage present in its territory with the participation of communities, groups, and relevant non-governmental organizations. So I'm reminding you that that's what the convention says. Also, within the framework of its safeguarding activities of the intangible cultural heritage, oops, I have an extra comma, each state party shall endeavor to ensure the widest possible participation of communities, groups, and where appropriate, individuals that maintain and transmit such heritage and to evolve them actively in its management. So we're just reminding that the convention really emphasizes this. And this is something that Richard Curran from the Smithsonian also has said is very important about this convention. He says, taken at its word, this, Article 15 that I just read to you, implies that members of the communities whose heritage is being safeguarded are to be full partners with any and all such efforts. Governments or university departments or museums cannot just assume they have permission to define ICH and undertake its documentation, presentation, protection, or preservation. So here they're saying community participation is meant to be meaningful, and they're to be full partners.